So there are still quite a few Navajos that joined the Marine Corps. This legacy within these traditional cultures, the oral legacy, the verbal legacy of their parents, their grandparents, their families, their clans is still rich and alive, and we still receive significant populations from the Navajo Nation and other nations. And so we, because I was the senior guy that was told, hey, you're going to go to the Navajo Nation. I said, great, I'll do it, but we got to let any Marine who's a Navajo who wants to come, we got to pay for them, and they can come too. So we spent the day with the elders and with the crowd. I was explaining to Dan, they literally put this huge circus tent up, probably 2 times the size of this room, packed it, probably 500 people packed into this thing, and a hay wagon up front that I was sitting on with one of the last Navajo code talkers. And then we had this phalanx of young Navajos who were in service to the Marine Corps still. And just about everybody in that tent waited in single file line after we were done to thank us for our service. So I was a little hoarse in that video because I'd sat there for 2 hours shaking hands and talking to people. It was an amazing day. So anyway, I ended up joining the Marine Corps out of law school. I got out in the mid-90s because I had a young family and I was ready to get on with my life. I never intended to stay in. After 9/11, as I had said, I ended up deploying, for almost a decade. 7 years out of 10, I was gone from my wife and kids. Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. And I was a bit like Forrest Gump. I ended up in the worst possible places on earth at the right moment of historic inflection. So I did the initial invasion, the initial battle of Nazario, and the whole Jessica Lynch thing went down. I did 2 tours, both battles of Fallujah. I did Haditha, Kandahar City in Afghanistan. I just kept landing in these places that I don't think I'm responsible for, but they all went very south very fast, and we had a lot of work to do. And because of that, and because of the fact that I got a disproportionate amount of credit for the work that my Marines did, and I was very lucky that nothing calamitous happened on my watch, and I mean that sincerely, blessed by God that nothing like that happened, I got promoted. And so my wife and I always had this feeling that I joined because I felt like I had a citizenship tax. My grandparents were immigrants, and I was pretty privileged, so I wanted to earn my bones. And so that was kind of how we approached service. If we were wanted and there was a mission to do and we were doing okay, then we would continue. And that's how 35 years went by. Okay, so that's my background. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the world. I think most people are interested in Iran. So hopefully, a couple things here. If you can guess my politics when I'm done today, I have failed. I'm going to just be a very straight shooter and call it like I see it, regardless of political feelings here, okay? This is just my experience of serving in the Middle East and understanding what's actually happening. So let's talk about where we are now. We're on the cusp of global peace, right, that's emanating from the Middle East. And it's not going to last. And here's why. Because this is an eschatological issue for one side, and it's a political issue for the other side. And the sides aren't clear. The sides have factions and fractions within them. And any one of those factions and fractions can dismantle this thing, and they will. And I'll explain why. Okay, let's look at the Iranian side. That's a big word that seems to be kind of big hand, little map, we used to say. But within the Iranian side, what you're really talking about, who holds the power in Iran right now is the IGRC, that acronym that you have heard all over the news. But no one really explains to the American people who they are and what their genesis story is. And you have to understand that if you believe that peace can be achieved here. The IGRC came to life in the late 70s in and around the revolution in Iran. Now, the United States, we were just talking about this here at lunch. When we say the word revolution, we naturally think, especially this year, back to the American Revolution, which was about liberty and becoming free from the UK and starting our own country. It was very much a national play. The Iranian Revolution is a global revolution, not limited to the contiguous boundaries of Iran. It's a 12er Shia eschatological position in what they believe. Now, I'll break that down a little bit. The 12er Shia believe that their responsibility on earth are to set the conditions for the return of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. Now, this is going to start sounding a little woo-woo because it's not how Americans naturally think. And if you can't hold their attention for 5 seconds, they're going to scroll right past you, right? But this is what the revolution was founded for. It had nothing to do with Iran. It was about seizing power in Iran in order to metastasize the revolution and set the conditions globally for the return of the Mahdi. The Mahdi returns, and this is where the schism between the Sunni and the Shia branches of the Muslim faith come together. It's to resolve that once and forever. For right now, the Saudis, the Sunnis, control the two holiest sites in Islam. Does anybody know what they are? Mecca's one. Yeah, what's the other one? Medina. Yeah, Mecca and Medina. The Twelvers believe that the Shia should control those sites. So it is all about setting the conditions for the return of the Mahdi, and when he returns, he will create justice across the globe. That's the benign language they will use. What does that mean? It means there's only one religion. It is Shia Islam. It is all about fundamental Shia Islam. And there is no tolerance for Christianity or anything else to include Sunniism. And that is a core belief. That is a core belief. And that in order for them to set the conditions for the return of the 12th Imam, there has to be global chaos, and they must suffer. They must suffer. So if you turn the map around and you consider the arguments that I see of the talking heads on the news all the time or on a video, they're always talking about great hardship inside of Iran. We're really punishing them. They don't see it as punishment. They see this as the fulfillment of a prophecy. That's a stark, cold reality that you have to understand. All right, so now within Iran, the IGRC kind of before the war had responsibility for three separate arms of Iranian influence. The first one is the nuclear program. They see that as existential to their survival and to bring forth the 12th Imam. So as opposed to North Korea that has always used, we always kind of talked about North Korea as using the nuclear umbrella as a shield, the hermit kingdom, stay away from me, survival of the regime, but there was no ambition that we could really identify for North Korea to break out and take over South Korea or go into China or anyplace else. It was about the survival of the regime because they're on the cusp of starvation all the time. I remember being put on alert in the 90s, meaning we literally lined up on these big asphalt places we call the grinder, and they start giving you shots, in your arms and in your butts, and they're issuing you ammunition, and you're going to March Air Force Base, and you're flying away to execute a war plan. And I was in that line. We were getting shots. We were going during President Clinton's watch to execute the Korea war plan. And he called it off because he made the decision it wasn't worth sacrificing tens of thousands of Americans and others because he didn't see the North Koreans becoming nuclearized as a long-term global threat. Okay? Different scenario here. The belief from people who are educated, who actually look at this without a political viewpoint, that have lived this life for an entire generation, is that when they achieve a nuclear capability, they will use it in order to bring back and set the conditions for the return of the Mahdi. So just wrap your head around that for a second. How do you negotiate with somebody like that? Okay, so that's the IGRC. So they controlled the nuclear program. They controlled the external arm of the Iranian regime, and that was Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others. So what's happened to that external arm right now? Hamas has essentially been neutralized. The Houthis, there's not great alignment because ethnically they're not the same, and also they're not Twelvers, they're not Mahdi Shia. So it's a political convenience. The Iranians sponsor the Houthis, but the Houthis aren't like ride or die with the IGRC. Hezbollah, absolutely. So this is why right now the IGRC and the Iranian control, the people in control, are demanding that Israel ceasefire in Lebanon right now as part of the overall truce with the United States. Because Israel has Hezbollah largely isolated, a significant portion of them, and they're doing tremendous damage. And it is the last remaining reliable arm outside of Iran that the IGRC has to hold the world at risk. And they can't afford to lose it, like they feel like they lost Hamas. And that's what Lebanon's all about. The news says Lebanon, it's all about Hezbollah. And the IGRC's unwillingness to allow them to be sacrificed like a tethered goat as part of a peace program that they don't believe in anyway. All right. The last thing the IGRC controls are the drones and the ballistic missiles. So the president of Iran, who's not part of the IGRC, might have signed a peace treaty. The IGRC didn't sign it. And if you understand the kind of the Persian or the Iranian methodology of negotiations, and I'm sure you've heard this on the news, it is all about obfuscation, delay, defend, especially when you feel like you're tired of getting punched in the face and you just want it to stop for a little while. And I'll give you an example. And I'll give you a fair example of how both sides were kind of misleading from last June. Let's talk about the United States first. In June, we did this 12-day war, and after the war concluded, both the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States used the exact same term to describe what happened to the Iranian nuclear capability. Does anyone remember what the word was? I just paid attention. I thought, what an odd thing for them to use the same word that is not super common. Anybody remember the word? Obliterated. So what does obliterated mean? Like literally turned into dust and blown away, right? Gone forever. So in February 28th, we began unilateral action with Israel against Iran, and within days, the president has to go before key members of Congress and explain why he initiated hostilities without going to Congress first. And what did he say? They were on the cusp of achieving a nuclear weapon. 7 months earlier, it was obliterated. In February or early March of this year, we're on the cusp. And I'm not saying he was misleading or anything else. I'm just saying those two truths can't be true at the same time, right? It's either a tremendous error or it was an intentionally misleading. Now, that's just from our side. Now, the Iranians see that, right? Our allies and everyone sees that. Not widely reported in the United States. Now, on the other side, what ended up happening was immediately the ballistic missiles and the nuclear capability are interrelated. Iran knows that in order to truly hold the world at risk, they have to be able to deliver nuclear weapons, at least to Europe, and eventually to the United States. And then they can be left alone to bring back the conditions for the return of the Mahdi with complete understanding they're not going to be invaded. So those two programs are super interrelated. And that's why early in the war, if you remember, the Iranians fired a ballistic missile towards Diego Garcia. If you draw a map, if you put a pin in the map and you drew a line to Diego Garcia and then you extended it, you're seeing it's covering Europe. What they're saying is, we can reach Europe. So immediately after the June war, we attacked the precursors for the ballistic missiles. Think fuel, like how the missiles, how they're fueled. We attacked that and destroyed that. Those were some of the above ground complexes you saw on the news in Isfahan that we bombed and destroyed. Well, we didn't know this was going to happen, but almost immediately within days, before the week was out after the ceasefire, the Chinese were in there, and they arranged for the Iranians to receive fuel from them, and it was refined and enhanced fuel that actually increased the range of their missiles. And again, this is something you're not going to see on the news. The missiles before, their guidance systems were relying on something called GPS, Global Positioning System. It's a constellation of American navigation satellites in space. So, the best case scenario, if your enemies have a capability, you want it to be your capability because you're kind of holding the cards then, right? Gives you all kinds of interesting options. But the Chinese switched them onto the Beidou 3 constellation, which is Chinese, and it enhanced their accuracy. So literally, in that 7-month period, those ballistic missiles became more accurate because of the guidance systems and had more reliable and better fuel. So that capability after 7 months did, in fact, increase. This is just a threat analysis, has nothing to do with a political viewpoint. So those are things that were happening. We didn't appreciate the fact that the Chinese would be such an overt and active surrogate for Iran. And now you're hearing about these drone air defense systems that the F-15 that got shot down in April, what they encountered over Iran, something we've never seen before, but very similar to the videos you might see of the massive Dragon drone displays in China. So they basically create nets with drones at altitude for our fighters, and an F-15 flew into it and was shot down by one of them. We can't do that. All right, so this is a much more complicated and nuanced war than people are led to believe. But the variables have not changed. And by that I mean, it is the obligation of anyone associated with the IGRC who hold power in Iran right now to suffer and set the conditions globally for the return of the Mahdi. Now, ideologues, it's a funny thing, you think about this, and we'll contrast like Cuba and Iran, for example. So think about this. If you were involved in the revolution in the late 70s as a leader, let's say you're still motivated enough to do it, so let's say you're probably in your 30s, right? You're still fired up enough to go out in the street and do that sort of thing. Well, by the time this war came around, how old are you? You're in your 80s, right? You're either a senior in your 70s or you're an octogenarian. So that means that 2 successive generations of leaders have been born into the IGRC. And as it turns out, having spent my adult life chasing ideologues around the globe, 1 or 2 things happen generationally. Either they become more convicted because that's all they know. They were raised in this vacuum of information and conditioned on beliefs that that's all they understand. And they become successively more ideological. Or they begin to have fatigue. So in Cuba, you're starting to see the average Cuban, and this has to do with the diaspora and in the communication age and the inability to keep people in isolation from information, but they become fatigued. And they're just like, I just want to have my air conditioner work and maybe have some fresh water. I don't care about the Communist manifestos. It's not working for me. And you get the fatigue, or you get a deeper conviction. And what I believe is, in Iran, in the IGRC, the conviction is still deep. And remember that the suffering is part of a prophecy coming true. It's not about suffering. It's about success. Okay, so where are we now? So within that, let's just take the Iranian side. So you have the IGRC, and in there are factions, but largely they're still united, and they are still functioning. And they are getting additional help from the Chinese and the Russians with artificial intelligence. They understand, we've been using artificial intelligence for a long time. So you see the opening gambits about all these airstrikes and targets. When you're in the middle of a mission, targets are emerging and closing down, and it's a massive geometry problem. You might have a bunch of people in a helicopter flying and then you have bombers and fighters coming in, and you're deconflicting airspace, you're turning on and off air defense systems. It is a very complicated dance down to the fraction of a second. And so now we use artificial intelligence when we're targeting in order to deconflict and do very dynamic changes that have second and third order effects for thousands of people that are on the water, under the water, in the air at any given time in the middle of the night. That's how we do it. And we're the best in the world at it. But now the Iranians, with the help of their surrogates, are using artificial intelligence to understand how we do things, how we think, and so therefore how to hide better, how to obfuscate better, and how to defeat our tactics. So this pause was politically necessary from a Western perspective, but it's exactly what the IGRC needed to survive. So here's what they're thinking now. They're thinking, okay, especially with the War Powers Resolution vote that just happened in the Senate here the last couple of days. Everyone know that the Senate, yeah, okay. All right, so the Senate said, hey, Mr. President, you got to come back to Congress for permission to resume hostilities. Every administration says this, it doesn't matter. I worked for 9 different administrations, 7 different presidents. They all feel the same way about the War Powers Resolution. It doesn't matter. It's not a Democrat or Republican issue. They don't believe that it's grounded in law and that it's constitutional nor enforceable, and they will kind of tisk the Congress that they don't understand that decisions have to be made at the speed of relevance, and being the president is a really hard job. That's how they all think. So, and this one's no different. But what the Iranians are now thinking, okay, that's a win for us, and now even if the Republicans control the House, so there's no chance that, I don't believe, that this particular president is going to be ordered unanimously through the House. That resolution has got to pass the Senate and the House, and the Republicans control the House. So I don't think it's going to happen, and even if it did, the president's probably saying, I don't think it's constitutional anyway, I'm going to do what I want. That's the way this thing's kind of shaping up. But what the Iranians now believe is, hey, in November, there's going to be a midterm election. We string this thing along, the House could flip, and now we're in business. So what you'll expect to see is they will continue to fumble the football down the field. They'll put mines in the water. They'll close the straits. They'll fly some drones here. Oh, that was my cousin Muhammad. He's crazy. I'm sorry about that one. That's on us. Okay, we're sorry. Okay. And then the United States will say ceasefire is still in effect because the war powers resolution by the legal argument of this administration is told in timeout as long as we're calling it a ceasefire. So that's the game we're playing right now. So what's happening on both sides? So the Iranians are massively rearming and hardening their position and preparing to fight again. And the United States is probably beginning an operational level refreshing of the force. So whenever you have a Navy ship at sea, think about an aircraft carrier. We use that, right? We've got 2 of them over there right now. Now, what is an aircraft carrier? It's thousands of human beings, Americans, who are volunteers who run a nuclear reactor aboard every aircraft carrier, an airport, and an air wing. All of that has to be maintained. The aircraft have to be maintained, the nuclear reactor has to be maintained, the ship has to be maintained, and the human beings have a threshold of sustained stress that they can endure before they got to be rotated out. And we're right at that window. So what you'll probably see is, hey, great news, the Lincoln's coming off station. Great, but the Washington's probably coming right in behind it. And that's what I would be watching for. And that's a tell to say that all of the belligerents involved believe that we're in timeout, but the game's going to start again. It would be the professional surprise of my life if we didn't start fighting again. The question is that whoever is going to initiate the next round is going to believe that the other side is gaining too much of an advantage in the intermission. The other side will begin. Now, let's throw in Hezbollah and Israel. The crazy cousins over here. God, I love them, man, but they're wild, If you're looking at this through Israel's eyes, they're thinking to themselves, hey, they're talking to the Americans, they're saying, hey, have you not heard the death to America chants for the last 47 years? Do you not think that that's real? I mean, they believe this. And okay, that's worked so far. But they also understand that this is their existential moment. That if Iran survives, they understand the eschatological nature of what the Mahdi 12 or Shiism is, and that eventually they're going to be in the crosshairs. They're target number 1. And they watch these ballistic missiles, and they understand the nuclear program, and they're convinced that they will receive a nuclear weapon if this comes to fruition. So this is their existential moment. So do you think for a second that they're not going to do whatever that's in their national interest to derail this peace talk? No, they're going to do what they need to do as a nation. The same thing with the IGRC. If the IGRC abides by the terms that the U.S. administration is saying that was agreed to, they're in mortal danger. They're in mortal danger. They rule by fear and domination. The arm that controls the Iranian people inside of Iran is called the Beji, and the Beji has been crippled. And the Iranian people are waiting, and they're waiting. And the second they believe that the balance, the imbalance, there will be another revolution inside of Iran. Okay, so there are 1,000 ways for this thing to become unwind. I guess as a person of faith, I'm thankful that right now we're not killing each other, but I'm also a person who spent 35 years dealing with the monsters under the bed as they were, not as I wish they were. And that's how I see what's happening right now. Okay, so there's my little burst on what I think is happening. But now here's the other. The glass menagerie. If you're a fan of Tennessee Williams, that Academy Securities collects in the way of all of us retired folks, we each kind of have a little bit of a specialty. Some are in AI, some are in space. I spent 7 years working Latin America as a general of my 11 years, so I'm very familiar with Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, in the entire Andean Ridge. So if you want to talk a little bit about the future of Cuba and the economic opportunities of Venezuela, I'm happy to talk about that too. So subject to that, let's start with the questions.
Great. I'll tell you what, Peter's going to have a microphone walking around. And thank you for that introduction. That was incredible. Thanks.
So you say the Chinese helped the Iranians with their satellite positioning?
Yeah.
But the Chinese also helped U.S. and Western Europe by cutting their imports of oil substantially. Do you think they'll do that again if fighting resumes?
So here, that's a great question and a fair question. Here's what I believe. It's like Ukraine. Remember in 2022 when Xi went to visit Putin before the Sochi Olympics and right before the invasion of Ukraine. Now we knew, I was still in uniform, we knew the invasion was going to happen. I mean, there were certain tells that it's obvious there's going to be, especially with an armored invasion, their fuel and tanks, or all these things that we know means they're going. It's coming, right? So it wasn't a surprise to us when they actually crossed. And so I just imagine this room where Putin is explaining to Xi that, hey, they're going to, Ukraine's part of their near abroad. It's culturally super important to us. It's always been part of the Russian Empire, on and on and on. In his mind, he's laying out the argument for Taiwan to the Chinese. And Xi's probably sitting there very pensively, and occasionally he'll give a slight nod, and Putin's like, yes, I got him, right? So here's what I think Xi was thinking. There was a famous treaty that the Russian Empire imposed on the Chinese in the late 1800s, and they took vast parts of Manchuria, including access to what the Chinese call the North China Sea. And that's where the Russians have their major naval bases and access to the Pacific Ocean and the Arctic. And it's part of the century of humiliation that the Chinese talk about. And it's something that they fully intend to rectify. They also look to their west and they see Russia, and what they see, just like when they see the Americas, is vastly underpopulated regions with immense natural resources. So in Xi's mind, I think he's thinking when Putin's talking to him, he's thinking, okay, wait, let me get this straight. You're going to take all of your military forces and you're going to go to the west away from me. Okay, I like what I'm hearing. Keep going. All right, then you're going to get involved in a war that either you're going to walk through the Ukrainians and the West isn't going to do a thing to stop you, and that's going to green light me logically for Taiwan. I win. Or you're going to get involved in some kind of meat grinder. The West is going to raise up, and you're going to bleed yourself out in Ukraine, and it's going to make the protection of your eastern resources even more acute. I win. So the Chinese, we play checkers and chess, which are kind of binary outcomes. The Chinese play this game called Go. And the whole theory of the national game is to have multiple games within a game at any given time with multiple positive outcomes. And whatever positive outcome seems to be coming to fruition, you reinforce that outcome. It's kind of like Sun Tzu, and the theories of war were surfaces and gaps, and that's how they think. So they have multiple positive outcomes in play all the time around the world. If one of them goes south, it's no big deal. They got 8 others to play that are going pretty well over here. So they look at Iran the same way, just like they look at Ukraine. The best thing for China is to keep it going. Keep it going. Keep it going. Because the West is draining itself down, they're preoccupied over here, and it's buying them decision space. Now, at some point, there's a threshold where the Chinese economy really becomes hurt, and the Chinese middle class begins to feel it. Here's the Achilles heel of the Chinese Communist Party, and I'll break it down in a single data point. If you look at the average consumption of protein by your typical Chinese citizen from the year 2000 to now, I think the last statistics I saw was in 25 years, it went up 13x. So that's what happens when you get an upwardly mobile middle class, right? So what does that create? Expectations, right? So that begins when you see the riots and the very draconian measures the Chinese government had to take on the Chinese people during COVID. You saw those videos, right, of people jumping out of windows and they're quarantining entire cities and they're locking people down. It's because there was a dissonance there between expectations that they had realized and the regime tried to impose control that might have been accepted and understood maybe as recently as the 90s, but now the Chinese people push back on it. So the number one existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party is control of the Chinese population. So what I watch for is the quality of life and the consumer indexes inside of China as it relates to oil coming out. And when that thing starts to go sideways, now Xi has lost decision space. But anything I've seen so far hasn't really affected him yet. So that's what I would watch for. So if it hasn't really affected them yet, then they're going to do what they always do. Keep this fire burning over here. If it looks like it's going to start getting resolved, put your finger on the scale over here to keep the fire burning. If it starts going out over here, put your finger here, keep the fire burning, and that's in their interest. Because it keeps us preoccupied. 2 carrier strike groups, 2 Marine Expeditionary Units, our entire strategic tanker fleet, all the things that we have absolutely concentrated in the Middle East right now, that works to the Chinese favor. It gives them options. And that's a good place to be if you're a strategic leader. Yeah. Thank you.
It's clear that you think that there will be a resumption of the hostilities in Iran. How would you handicap an actual land invasion?
Oh, land invasion? 0. I have been part of invasions. And I just don't think anyone, I mean, I remember in Iraq in the summer of 2003, sitting on a cinder block, smoking a Marlboro, and talking to a friend of mine saying, this is the last time anyone will ever let us. So the American way of war since World War II, we're just talking about Europe and England, World War II, we turned England into this iron mountain, the UK, and we brought all these ships and concentrated these massive mountains of supplies and ammunitions, and we went across the channel, right, into Normandy. And then we've been basically doing that same thing. Think about this, like the Persian Gulf in 1990, same thing. We all went into Saudi Arabia, lined up, got ready, tightened it up. Okay, we got a little straighter over here, bring some more ammo, put that there, let's store some gasoline over here. And they waited for us. In 2003, the exact same thing. Once again, we're in Kuwait. I'm in some hole on the Iraqi border looking up at the stars, thinking tomorrow morning we're going to invade Iraq. And we had tens of thousands of Marines and soldiers lined up with as much ammunition and fuel as we could carry, and we were going. That'll never happen again because we can be seen and reached. It's just way more dangerous and harder to do, and the costs will be way higher. So there's a number of reasons why we won't invade Iran. Number one is what I just said, but number two, the topography. The ground we'd have to fight across to get to Tehran is way more complicated than it was for us to get to Baghdad. It would be similar to Afghanistan, but we were not fighting a cohesive entity in Afghanistan. We were fighting, this ethereal mist that was running around us. So I don't think that's going to happen. However, I do think that we would probably see a series of raids. What is a raid? A raid is a kind of a limited objective. You're going to do one thing, and you're planning to leave when you go there. So we might take Karg Island. There are 7 islands right in the Straits of Hormuz that are part of the Iranian philosophy for defense of the Straits and control of the Straits. I think they're called the 7 Pearls or something like that. But the 2 really important ones, you hear them in the news occasionally, listen for it. Keshem is one, you hear that one quite a bit, and Lakram. And I can see those 2 Marine Expeditionary Units. So a Marine Expeditionary Unit is this group of ships that has Marines embarked that float around the world. And they have everything from jet fighters to attack helicopters to artillery to infantry. There's thousands of Marines in each one of these task forces, and they're highly trained and certified to go and respond to contingencies, and they just float around the water. And usually, if you have one in the Persian Gulf, for example, you might have one in the South China Sea. You might have one, who knows, but they're spread out. We put 2 together back in April. And the last time we put 2 together like that, we call that Marine Expeditionary Brigade, was in October 2001 when we went into Kandahar. Hasn't happened since. So it's a high-risk move. It's a lot of ability. And they've kept those 2 on station, but they're having the same problem. That is an aircraft carrier, essentially. They're launching joint strike fighters and attack helicopters, and Marines are, sitting on a ship. You got a bunch of 19-year-olds. How often do you go to the weight room? They need to go do something. So I would say at some point I would not be surprised to see them take Karg Island, Geshem, Lakram, or do raids to go in and destroy cruise missile launch sites and other things if we start up again.
Hi, General. Thanks for being here today. Your inside knowledge is amazing to me. My question is, and thanks for being here, my question is, do you think the administration is talking to people like you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the people that are still in uniform, if I don't know them, I'm one person removed from them, and they're me. I mean, the environment made me. the Marine Corps didn't really make me. You know, the threats and the environment, and you know, you get education. You know, so the people in uniform absolutely understand this, no question. Like the idea somehow that we were going to execute the Iran. So think about this: there is a war plan for Iran. I joined in 1988 during the Reagan administration. Okay, there was a war plan on the shelf when I joined. That same war plan was on the shelf when I left in the Biden administration in 2024. So this is not a surprise. Both sides have been preparing for this. What's changed is capabilities, and maybe some politics, but the fact that this fight was coming was a surprise to neither side who were in the business of fighting, right? So the idea that this could have been over in weeks, there's nobody who is a trained professional who has actually spent time in the sand and also has been trained to think strategically that would have said there was any chance of that. Well, again, I'm not going to make a political statement. I'm just telling you the uniformed people. I mean, we're dealing with people's sons and daughters. I mean, I have a son that's a Marine. And you literally think of these young people as your children. I mean, it's hard to describe. You love them as if, you have to love them as if they're your child. But you also have to order them into harm's way. And it's a strange relationship, but it is very profound and deeply felt. So you're just not going to find somebody in uniform that would just go along to get along like that. I guess I'm sure it's possible. Let me just say this. I never met anybody in the Marine Corps that was my peer that lasted more than 7 years that would have ever thought that. Because you're in the business of, it's for keeps kind of thing, and you realize your sacred and moral obligation are to take these young American volunteers and return them fortified on their experience, not damaged by it. So I have no problem speaking truth to power, and none of my friends did either. Now, whether the politicians, the elected officials act on it, that's a whole other thing. Yes? I'm sorry.
Question. So we've been hearing in the news lately about generals getting fired.
I hate that.
I know, but
it's terrible.
So do I.
Terrible precedent.
No, but it scares me, and I just kind of wonder, I would love your perspective on why that's happening, and doesn't that hurt our security as a country?
Generals get fired a lot. How can I put this? So when you pick up your second star, that's the last time you don't have to go through Senate confirmation and the president signing off on it, basically. When you go to 3 and 4 stars, it's highly charged politically. And people in Congress will hold up a general or an admiral's promotion because she's just the tethered goat because Senator so-and-so wants to get this issue resolved, and they're going to hold the Department of War hostage until that agenda is resolved, and they don't really care about the fact that I'm up for my 4-star. And initially, when you're younger in service, you're a little outraged by that. But as you mature into it, you realize, hey, you're playing on house money anyway. And so we know that you get fired out of political convenience. Now, like you, I can, like when President Biden was in office, this is not a political statement, it's just reality. Women and minorities were the priority. You had to go and answer a question, hey, I saw the general list came out, how come there aren't any Hispanics on it? And this was a question I literally fielded. Okay, we pick 10 generals a year. That's it. And, maybe you have a Hispanic, and the chances of making 1-star general, I forgot what the odds are, it's like 0.00001%. It's just, there's super qualified people, you might get it, you might not get it, And to say that 0.001% of what distinguished Dan here, and the fact that he doesn't fit a demographic that's politically convenient for whoever's in charge at the time, those things happen. And you spend 35, honestly, it happened to me. And you spend 35 years, and they say, yeah, you're not the right person we're looking for. So you have 2 ways to go. You can be angry, or you can be gracious. I knew that I was incredibly lucky. I came out of all that without any terrible wounds. I have my family still intact, and I can be joyful and thankful and go home quietly and peacefully and enjoy the rest of my life. Because politics, it's just politics. So I would say The last one, Donahue, the guy that was in the news right now, he is an exceptional warrior. But I don't know what happened behind closed doors, you know. But I also know that he's enough of a professional that he'll just take it on the chin and move on, like everybody else. It's not, I mean, it's a different class, different culture.
Hey, thanks for your service. My question is, what was the flawed calculus in the invasion? It looked like they had something lined up where they were decapitating the regime. I think the expectation, at least reading between the tea leaves, was they were going to cause an uprising and they'd force regime change and it'd be a quick fix. And
Yeah.
by the way, it was already simmering, so you just had to light the match, right?
Yeah.
What was, given your history
Yeah.
and everything you laid out
Okay.
here and all the knowledge everybody had?
All right, so this is Bellon pulling this, you know, out of his hat. Okay, so this is what I think happened. If you recall, in January, there were 2 weeks that straddled January and February where the Iranian regime, our best estimates now, the best intelligence I've read, is killed 36,000 people, okay, of their own citizens. If you did a, you know, by the numbers, you know, based on populations per rata, that would be like the U.S. government going out and killing, I think, 138,000 people. Okay, and what did that look like? The Beiji, and I've seen this in this part of the world. We would come upon scenes like this, whether it's Al Qaeda or ISIS or somebody else. This is still a very tribal part of the world, and demonstrations of violence for the public to see are still very real. And people get called into a stadium in a place like Haditha, and they cut off the heads of the police in front of everybody in the town. You know, that still happens. And what the Beiji did was they went around and they pulled people out of their houses and they killed them, sometimes beating them to death in front of all their neighbors. And then then it's very typical, they'll say, you leave the body for 2 days because in Islam you have to be buried by sunset. So that level of absolute carnage went on. And very cleverly, the Iranian people appealed directly to the President of the United States. And they said, please help us. And what did he say? Anybody remember? Help is on the way, remember? Help is on the way. So if you're not somebody, that has experienced violence like you understand how ugly and nasty the world can be, and you see something like that and you're in charge, you can have an emotive response. Help is on the way. So this is where, and I look at this almost kind of like after 9/11, you know, if you read your history, there was a couple of folks that got close to President Bush at the time and convinced him of certain things. And that happens, right? Because you're dealing with people that don't deal in violence. They don't deal in, you know, death and confrontation and fighting, you know. And so they have these moments because they're decent people, you know, and they're emotive. And so what I think happened is there was a belief that we could tip the scales and we could attack Iran, denude their ability, their nuclear capability, their drones, their ballistic missiles, kill the Ayatollah and a few others, which was masterful. And that would set the conditions for revolution from within. The revolution from within, man, there's so many variables involved in that. You know, to think that we could create that, I think that if there was a flaw in the planning at all, is that some people that were close to the president might have believed that that was possible, or likely, I should say. It's always possible. But it hasn't happened yet, right? So that means there's a continuing murder and intimidation campaign that's ongoing. And this happens all over around the world. This is what happens, you know. And that's probably the flaw. When the books are written, that's what I'll be, if I'm alive still, I'll be interested to see if that's what the thinking was. Yeah.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned boots on the ground. You mentioned drones, some playbooks that have been written at some point in time. Curious, as we think about technology, and we've talked a lot about AI already today, what you think about warfare in the future and perhaps a leveling of playing fields among countries that we wouldn't have thought of before.
Yeah, great question. The last part is really interesting, the leveling of the playing field. Warfare itself, it's almost like the space. Remember, like we were all growing up, and you know, I don't know, I hope some of you are, it's definitely my age. And you're in the space program, right? We got Tang, we got all these really cool things from the same thing happens in war. There's a massive push, an evolution of technology, because cash gets hemorrhaged into the machine and all these ideas move forward in the accelerator. And so throughout history, I mean, you can go back to, certainly gunpowder, and then before that it was probably the crossbow, and then gunpowder. As somebody like who's been to war college and all these other places, I could read you these seminal moments. World War I was unbelievable. You had airplanes and machine guns that just changed the nature of war. And then you had the Slow Learners Club, where you had generals and other people that grew up, kind of fighting the same types of wars that we fought in the Civil War, tried to fight that way in the age of aircraft, artillery, and machine guns, and they lost 20, 30,000 people a day in battles. Okay, so and then of course atomic weapons and all these other things come. But your last point is really interesting and something I've been thinking about. Taiwan, if anything, China is probably really nervous because this kind of porcupine that Ukraine has made itself into, that's now got some fangs, that is striking into Russia, there's no way. If you look back to 2022, the common narrative, even by the professionals, was, hey, it's a math problem. And sooner or later, Russia will win, right? That's what we were all told. But here's the thing, and this is going to sound awful, but war is like the most human element. Maybe having a kid is the most human element, but you see the very best and the very worst of mankind in war. You see selflessness and self-sacrifice, and you see absolute brutality. But you also see it in this exceptional leap forward in capabilities, tactics, and all these other things. But it's never static. It's always changing. It's always something else. For me in Iraq, for that part of my life, it was the IED. We crossed the border. We never heard of an IED. And then we did this cat and mouse game with radio-controlled IED, command wire IED, pressure plates. The Iranians were running around. We're capturing Iranians. I mean, it was ugly. We hadn't seen anything like it or trained to that. Now it's drones. And so what I think the second part of your question is really interesting. If you're not entrapped by a legacy military that you spent trillions on, and you can create a capability out of scratch, out of near nothing. It was that old saying about innovation, right? If you got plenty of time and plenty of money, you got no innovation. If you got neither, you got innovation, right? And so that's kind of what's happening right now. So that's a really interesting thing to watch. Like, how do we respond? We got all these legacy platforms that we've been doing and flying for decades. Are they relevant? The Marine Corps, for those of you that are geeks about this, and I self-identify as one, in 2019, we had watched this war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it was the first time that drones were used against a former Soviet or a Russian-equipped force, a classic armored force. And Azerbaijan did really well. And so the Marine Corps, we studied that as it happened in 2018, and then we got tasked to prepare in a no longer secret, but it was a secret document at the time, said your pacing threat is no longer terrorism, it's China. So we looked at ourselves, looked at China, and then looked at that war and said, oh my God, we're not prepared. So we divested ourselves of tanks and a bunch of other legacy equipment, and holy crap, you would have thought that we had surrendered to the Chinese or something, because the retired diaspora came unglued. How can you give up tanks? Like it's, because they're super hot, use a lot of gas, you can see them from space, and they tend to die in big balls of fire. That's why we don't want them, And so these things are always ongoing, and the professional military is always looking at it. But that last point is a really interesting one to watch.
I think there was one right over here.
Yeah. Okay. That's another good question. All right. So if I'm being benevolent and generous and crediting some strategic thinking here, I would say another mistake we made was initiating hostilities without informing our traditional allies, and then poking them in the eye afterwards for not jumping into the bar fight with us. That was a rough look, right? So now where are we? Why, what are the tactical reasons why the President of the United States would cling to a ceasefire when it doesn't look right? Because you might have somebody that's acknowledging a strategic blunder in that way. So if you spend the next months bending over backwards and occasionally letting the IGRC get their licks in and just constantly talking to Pakistan and the GCC and European allies and all, trying to repair that, and just it gets to the point where you're like, okay, they're not going to abide. They're not letting inspectors in. None of this is going to happen. They're going to get a nuclear weapon. We got to go back to war. Now you might get a minesweeper or something like that, or another flag, because you can also spend time diplomatically repairing some mistakes that were made. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but that's what Bellon would be advising if I was still in the game. Now, interestingly enough, early in the war, in that kind of March timeframe when we were really going at it, at that level of warfare, the only country in the world anymore that can stay with us and do that is Israel. I mean, the UK has disarmed itself. And NATO, of course, is consumed with Ukraine, rightfully so. So here's another way to look at this. I'm not saying stylistically I agree with any of this, because I'm just a different person than the personalities that are involved right now. But when I remember in 2006 when NATO agreed to reach the 2 to 3% GDP spending on their defense. Every president since Eisenhower has been trying to get Europe to pay their own way, and they haven't. And so now you've got this invasion that happens in 22, and the United States is sending billions of dollars. I know the narrative is we're not giving anything. That's wrong. First of all, we trained the Ukrainians. We taught them how to use Javelin missiles and ATVs and to kill Russians on the, we did all that. We were there for years helping them. And then we gave them a bunch of stuff. But what this administration seems to have done is said, okay, this is what happens when we tell you a fight's coming, you don't prepare for it, Europe, you're on your own, And now what's happened? So in 2022, on the day of the invasion, only 3 countries in NATO met the threshold of GDP spending. One was the United States, one was the UK, and they're not anymore. The other one was Greece. I'm sorry, there was 4, Poland. The other 32 countries still hadn't met it. This year, they've all met it, and they're talking about 5%. So stylistically, it's hard for me to watch. I just don't like the style and the way it's been done, but strategically, we can't afford as a nation, their quality of life and what the benefits they're able to give their people, we'd like to be able to do that to our people too. But we're paying for somebody else's defense. So to me, I look at this like in the long run, we're going to recover because the president will change and Europe will now understand, hey, that was a pretty close call. We got to lead in our own defense. We'll support you, but we're not going to be the lead in your defense. World War II has been over for a long time. So that's what I think is this thing's going to come out. I do believe that, look at the way the Europeans that come here for the World Cup, how pleasantly you see these videos of like how shocked they were about how nice Americans were and how welcome they were. Seriously, because like us, we're all subject to this polarizing media barrage we're getting from our phone, and the algorithms are figuring us out. And they come here and they can't believe, hey, have you gone to Buc-ee's? Oh my God, you can get a 5-gallon bucket of soda and people are nice there, That's really good for us because it reminds us, my grandparents were all European refugees, so we have a long memory and it'll be okay. That's what I believe.
Geopolitically, how much does Russia take a hit here? Because they come across as a paper tiger now. Other than
well, they're
like
not. They're again. You have to understand. Think about this. How much they've lost 1 million people. Now that's not counting. Remember when the war started, all those videos of all the military-age men that were leaving the country. So I'm not sure how many people know what the demographics of Russia were and the trends were before the Ukrainian war. But before the Ukrainian war, their demographic, they were in a death spiral demographically. They had stopped having children. They had a massive alcohol and drug abuse problem. And the country on every marker, like for advanced civilizations, was showing that it had terminal bone cancer. Now add in 1 million deaths. I don't know how many people have fled the country, and who flees the country? The people that can afford to, right? And the poor people end up getting drafted, conscripted, and they go fight. That's the way the world is. So what they have lost in this war, just from a human perspective, is massive. Now, from a fighting perspective, they're now the number is 8 to 1. They're losing 8 soldiers to every 1 Ukrainian. That's not sustainable. It's just not. And then you lose your industrial base to repair, rearm, rebuild, and all those things. And they have a vast territory to protect. And they have people on both sides, certainly the Chinese, who are eyeing it, saying, actually, you've just held a little bit of our land for a while. We're going to take that back now. I think that's going to happen in my lifetime.
All right, we have just a few minutes left, so probably time for one more question. So I don't have to pick from the crowd. I'm going to ask the last question. Sorry, John.
And he's going to do it in French. Just
there you go, exactly. We're going to totally shift gears to a different part of the globe in Venezuela.
Yeah.
So we had the raid in January, regime change, sort of.
Yeah.
What do you think the view is on Venezuela? How will that play itself out? Will American companies actually engage there?
Pues mi primera vez en Sudamérica fue en 1982, cuando yo fui trabajando por el ACJ. I've been going to South America since I was selected for a leadership exchange program in 1982 in high school. So I am not an objective person on this. Somewhere, somehow, God made me into a Latin Americanist. And I love, love, love the people and the many different cultures, but I also understand the dynamics here. So in fact, when I was working with Academy in December before the holidays, I had said, that they're going to make a move on Maduro right after the new year. Of course, I had no idea they were going to use the space ray guns or whatever they did and how they did it. It was amazing what they did. But I really did believe they were going to move on Maduro. And then I had said that Cuba will be in play by the spring. Because you have to understand how they're interconnected. When the Soviet Union collapsed in '89, the surrogacy for Cuba can't survive on its own, and the Soviet Union was a surrogate. In '89, Cuba went into this kind of spiral down until Chavez took over Maduro, and he became the surrogate. And so to understand, all these presidents have tried to solve the Cuban problem and satisfy the diaspora, but all you really had to do was unplug the ATM, and it would take care of itself. And the Trump administration, I was the director of plans and strategy for U.S. Southern Command in 2017, and the day that Secretary Mattis resigned, the next morning we got a be prepared to order, be prepared to plan for regime change in Venezuela. 2017. So when this group came back into office, it was a matter of time. Knew it was going to happen, right? So now with Venezuela gone, you have to understand that there's multiple facets to Cuba, Venezuela, and then Nicaragua will be next because it is the third rock from the sun, basically. But the first mission for Cuba, Venezuela is displacement of our adversaries. That's why Delcy Rodriguez is still in command. Because the Trump administration can say, get China, Russia, Iran out. Get them out. Get Hezbollah out, get everybody out. And here's your reward. Here's your $1 billion. Here's another $1 billion, but you got to do that. Now, what that allows is, very classically, this is great power competition. You want deniability. You don't want direct confrontation. You want a proxy between you and your co-belligerent so you can say, hey, that's not me, that's Delcy Rodriguez. She's the president, and they're out. So that's the first phase. And then the second phase is access to resources. So my partner, business partner, is a former ambassador, U.S. Ambassador Jimmy Story. He was the last U.S. ambassador to Venezuela under both Trump and then Biden. He and I wrote an article in February that was published by the Atlantic Council that basically lays this out. So if you're interested in what I'm about to tell you here in a second, you can look it up. But in order to understand the potential of Venezuela, you have to understand Colombia. In the 90s, Colombia was a failed state. It was a narco state. There were hardly any institutions of governance working. There were no functioning bureaucracies, right? And who was our cornerstone relationship, certainly in the Andean Ridge? Venezuela. Most people don't realize this. Venezuela had an educated, upwardly mobile middle class, and we used to train and educate their officers, their military, in the United States. They were our closest relationship in the Andean Ridge. So we took, and credit to President Clinton in his second term, at the end of his second term, he came up with this idea, and he called it Plan Colombia. And he talked about investing $10 billion over a minimum of 10 years in order to create security bubbles in Colombia in which they could begin to train administrators and bureaucrats and then professionalize the security forces. Now, a lot of presidents have a lot of great ideas at the end of their term, and the new president comes in and he or she says, boop, you're out. I'm on to my own good ideas. Credit to President Bush. He came in and he saw that, and this is after 9/11. Not only did he agree with President Clinton, he doubled down. And then President Obama behind him did the same thing. And even President Trump in his first term did the same thing. And what happened? Certainly before Petro, now it's a little weird. You've got a former Marxist guerrilla running the country. But before Petro, there was a functioning middle class, there were functioning bureaucracies, and they were a net exporter of security. They were taking over missions from us in Latin America to provide stability operations. Okay, huge success that no Americans know about. Massive success. And they had no legacy of a functioning government and zero natural resources. Now, contrast that with Venezuela, which as recently as 30 years ago had a functioning, happy, stable middle class that was ascending. They are mineral rich, they're petroleum rich, and they're so close to the United States that it's absolutely doable in a surrogacy. So if you applied the same patience and logic, and if we're mature enough as a people that it can cross political lines and cross administrations, Venezuela is absolutely doable. Absolutely. What I think is going to happen in Cuba is, the problem with Cuba is they don't have the natural resources that others have, but they can get into emerging industries like data centers, critical mineral resource and mining, they get back in their agriculture. So I'm not super sure how that economy is going to function, but the fact that they haven't threatened a mass exodus, which is their big lever to put millions of people on the water and overwhelm the southern United States, they're already signaling, this isn't working for us, we got to figure it out. So that's what I think is going to happen.
This has been a fabulous lunchtime session. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Thank you so much for your service. I think we can all agree this has been fabulous. So, General, thank you so very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.